Hey everybody, hope you're all having a fantastic week this week. Now, as we look and we dig into our study further, we're going to look at some interesting things and we're going to see the second part of our journey from Egypt to the Promised Land that the nation of Israel took. So last week we took 5 stops on our journey. This week we're going to take the next 5 stops, and our last stop is going to be right before the nation of Israel entered into the Promised Land. And so last week, whenever we finished up, we saw that the nation of Israel had come to Mount Sinai. And Moses had gone up on top of the mountain, and he had gone up there to receive the law from the Lord. Now, a lot of times we think of it just being the 10 Commandments and such. And yes, the 10 Commandments are part of that. But as we saw last week, there was so much more to it. It was had to do with the way they worshiped, the way they set up the temple, the way they set up their camp, the way they wore clothes, the food they could eat, the food they could not eat. All these different things were given to Moses while he was up there. And, as we mentioned last week, he was up there for a while. If we go and we look at it, just the chapters themselves, it encompassed 11 chapters of the book of Exodus was just the law that was given. So Moses was up there a long time receiving the law from God. A lot of times we think of the 10 Commandments and we think of those as the things that he brought down from Mount Sinai, yes, but yet he brought down so much more that they were supposed to do, so many different things that they were supposed to do as God's people. And so we're going to continue and see what happens after that. And I can't remember if I talked about this last week, but we did talk about this, I believe, a little bit, is that Moses was up there for a long time. Right? He was up there for a long time. And as we talked and as we saw last week, we know that the people of Egypt, the people of Israel, the Israelite people were very much impatient. They wanted things now. They wanted things. They got scared. They got frustrated. They didn't have the faith that they should have had. They didn't have all these things going for them. They had all these things, they had seen all these things that God had done, but yet they still didn't have faith in God, that God was going to see them through. So we're going to see, and the first thing we're going to stop is we're going to see what happens whenever the nation of Israel is sitting at the bottom of Mount Sinai waiting for Moses, and they get scared because he hasn't come down for a long time. So we're going to look at Exodus 32, beginning in verses 1 through 4. And the story goes on more and more, but we're just going to look at those first 4 chapters. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, "Up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." So Aaron said to them, "Take off the rings of gold that are in your ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hands and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." And so we saw this, and Aaron kind of came in. Now remember, Aaron was Moses' brother. So he was kind of second in command, over the people. So Aaron comes in, and they come to Aaron because Moses isn't there. And they implore him. They're like, Moses is gone. Moses has been gone so long, he's probably dead. An animal may have got him or something. So they come to him and they say, we need a God to worship. We need a God to worship. And don't even think about the times that they had just seen. The plagues that we talked about last week, the parting of the Red Sea, the manna from heaven, the water from the rock in the middle of the desert. All these miracles that they had just seen and saw. Yet they were so quick to forget about God. They were so quick to forget about everything that God had done. And they wanted a God that they could see, like the Egyptians. Last week we went over and we talked about the Egyptians. We talked about how, that the plagues were attacks on the Egyptian gods. And so they wanted gods that they could, that could be carved and seen, and idols that they had. And of course, it's interesting that one of the, Ten Commandments is you should have no other gods before me. And yet they built a golden calf. And they built that and they worshiped it. And, in the Bible it talks about how they were going to have a feast before that. And then we see here, in verse 7, it says, "And the Lord said to Moses, Go down, for your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." So, of course, God knows what's going on. So this happens. So God tells Moses that he needs to go down now and take care of this. So he goes down. And he comes down and he is furious. He is angry. And we see that he went down with the Ten Commandments, which were in 2 tablets that he had written on that had been written on, 2 pieces of stone that had been written on him. And as he came down, he took the calf, he burned it with fire, and scattered it around. Then he threw the pieces, the 10 Commandments, the original 10 Commandments, he threw those on the ground and they broke. And so we see how quickly, once again, that the nation of Israel forgot all that God had done. All that they had just seen, everything they had just seen, they forgot about. They forgot about the water, they forgot about the manna, they forgot about the escape from Egypt, the plagues. They forgot about all those things that God, who is unseen, did, but they wanted a God that they could see, a God that they would fall down to and worship. And unfortunately, Aaron went right along with him. He didn't stand up for his brother. He didn't stand up for God. He went right along with it. And, that's part of the problem that we see with that. And so, the people were upset and Aaron just went along with it. And as we go and we see our next journey, we're not going to read a passage for this one, but I'll kind of explain what happens with this one. So they come and they're getting ready to go into the land. They're getting ready to go into the land. Now, if you look pretty much at a map from that area, you can kind of see that there would be a quick, easy route to go from Egypt to where Israel is and was. But yet, that's not how God took them. So they came to a point, they waited. And they sent out spies to spy the land. They sent out 12. Now, 12 is a number that you'll hear over and over and over again as we go through our study in Joshua. Because every time there's 12 mentions, of course, it's one person from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so we'll see this, and as we go along and as we study, we'll see that several times throughout our study. So they sent 12 into the land. And so they came back, and they brought their reports. They came in, and 10 of them came and said, "Oh, there's giants in the land. There's these huge fortified walled cities that we'll never be able to conquer. We'll never be able to defeat. We never will." And then just 2 spies came back with positive reports. And that was Joshua and Caleb. Joshua and Caleb came back with positive reports about the land. About that we have to trust in God, knowing that He's going to give us the land. It's beautiful. God's told us He's going to give it to us. Let's do it. Well, unfortunately, the people decided. The people, unfortunately, took the word of the 10 spies who came back and gave a negative report, and didn't take the word of the 2 spies who was reiterating the fact of what God had done, what He had done for the nation of Israel since they brought them out of Egypt. Instead, they bring back negative reports, and they believe the negative reports. And so our next stop in our journey is going to pick up kind of right directly after these spies give their report. So we're going to see in Numbers chapter 14, and beginning in verse 20 to 25. Then the Lord said, "I have pardoned according to your word, but truly as I live, and as all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to test these 10 times and have not obeyed my voice, shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers, and none of those who despised me shall see it. But my servant Caleb, because he has a differing spirit and has followed me fully, I will bring him to the land into which he went, and his descendants shall possess it. Now, since the Amalekites and the Canaanites dwell in the valleys, turn tomorrow and set out for the wilderness by way of the Red Sea. So, they come to the land. They are prepared to go in. They can pretty much, probably where they're at, see part of the land. And yet, God sits here and tells them that they're going to be punished, except for Joshua and Caleb. We know that Joshua eventually goes on to be the leader of the nation of Israel. He takes Moses' place. He becomes the leader, and that's who we're studying in our study here. But we see that God was punishing Israel for not believing. And he said that 40 years that they're going to wander in the wilderness. And no adult who was alive during this time, who was alive to make that decision, would see the promised land. Would see the promised land. But their children would. But just think about this for a second. You know, how many times do adults make decisions and it hurts children? It hurts you. Maybe your parents have made a decision at some point and it hurt and affected you in a negative way. You know, I think sometimes, you know, whenever we think of this, sometimes I think of like divorce. And sometimes it's not anyone's fault, or it's not the child. It's definitely not the child's fault. But divorce is a situation that if there's children involved, it becomes more challenging. It becomes more difficult for it. And it affects the child's life that's in that. Maybe you've dealt with that in your times. You know, think about this. Maybe someone who's, you know, goes out and commits a crime and goes to jail. And they have to grow up without their father or their mother in that. Or even, you know, you could think to even other things. And, you know, a lot of times we like to think of these little things that affect us, but yet there's some big things that affect us too. So, you know, just think about ways in which, you know, your parents have affected you. Think about that all these kids would have seen their parents die before they got to the land. They're right there. They're within arm's grasp of reaching the land. And because of the decisions of the parents, they're not allowed to go into the land right then and see their parents grow old and have a proper place to bury them. They end up burying them in the wilderness. In essence, what happens is the nation of Israel ends up going around in circles and circles and circles. They see time and time again, they probably see the same place over and over again. They're wandering in the wilderness, wandering aimlessly in the wilderness, just waiting for 40 years to go by so that they can go into the promised land. And, you know, like I said, unfortunately, sometimes the decisions adults make affects kids. And a lot of times it may be negative. It may be very negative. It may be challenging for people. But yet, you know, that gives adults a huge responsibility to make sure that we're making the decisions that are best for our kids. You know, and yes, while we may think that it's best for our kids now, we don't know what effect that has on them. And so, you know, just be patient with your parents. I know it's hard. I know a lot of times we want them to, you know, always think about, you know, us and make decisions that positively affect us. But sometimes decisions that they make can sometimes affect us in ways that are challenging, affect us in ways that are hard. So just be patient, love your parents. They love you. It's just sometimes adults just make decisions, and we all make bad decisions. But just remember that, you know, and that's what we want you to get out of this passage, is that, you know, sometimes adults make hard decisions. Adults make difficult decisions, and sometimes they make the wrong decisions. But yet, sometimes it's the children that suffer. And that's where it gets challenging, and that's where it gets hard. So as we go to our next stop, we're going to go, it's this part of the wilderness wandering, we're going to go to Numbers chapter 20, verses 7 through 12. Numbers chapter 20, verse 7 through 12. And here we're going to see that, once again, the nation of Israel is thirsty. They're complaining because they do not have water. They don't have water. Once again, they're in the desert. And I don't know if you've ever been to the desert or seen pictures of the desert, but you always see these pictures where it's always hot. You always got these heat waves that you can see with your eyes, all those things. But yet we're going to see this. So We're going to see in chapter 20, as we look back before, we see that there was no water for them at this place where they were at. They went to a place, there's usually water there. There wasn't water this time. So we're going to pick up in verse 7. It says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before your eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them, and give drink to the congregation and their cattle. And Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he commanded him. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly before the rock, and said to them, Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice. And water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank and their livestock. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, Because you did not believe me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given you." So here's an interesting story. Once again, they come here, and God tells Moses to do something, to bring water out of the rock like he had did before. Think about it. Remember, we talked about that last week, how that God told Moses to strike the rock, and water would come out of the rock. And water would come out of the rock. So that's what Moses did back then. He told him to strike the rock. But here, he told him to do something different to the rock. He told him to speak to the rock. To speak to the rock. Once again, Moses makes a wrong decision. Moses doesn't listen to God. Moses is like not believing that God's going to do it, but he strikes it with his staff, just like he did before. Sometimes that's how it is for us. Sometimes we depend on the way things were, the way things happened before, and don't think that God can move in different ways or use us in different ways. But that's just not the case. God can use us in many ways. We just have to listen to him and pay attention to what he says. And we see this, and we're going to see this is once again going to be a theme throughout our book in Joshua, is how we're going to see that when the people get to the point where they don't go to God and they depend on themselves, or they depend on other things, they end up suffering for it. And we're going to see that in our study as well in the next couple of weeks as we go through that. So Moses was told to speak to the rock. Instead, he hit the rock twice. But yet, even though he did that and disobeyed God, God allowed water to come out. But there was a punishment for him not doing what God had told him. His punishment was that he was not going to lead the people into the promised land. He was not going to lead the nation of Israel into the promised land that he was going to do. See, Moses was one of the people who was going to survive because he believed the two spies, but the people didn't. But Moses was still the leader. Moses was going to see the promised land. Moses was going to lead the people into the promised land, but because he didn't have the faith to speak to the rock, and instead he struck the rock, he did not see the promised land. He would not step foot. And then we come to our last stop, right before we get to the promised land. So the nation of Israel is camped, preparing to go in. And we'll see that next week in our study as we start in Joshua 1. But what we see here is we see that Moses dies. Moses dies. So we're going to read Deuteronomy 34, verses 4 through 8. And the Lord said to him, that's Moses, "This is the land which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give to your offspring. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there." So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite Ber Peor. But no one knows the place of his burial to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was undimmed and his vigor unabated. And the people of Israel, wept for Moses in the plain of Moab 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. So here we come to the end of our journey from Egypt to the promised land. We're on the promised land, getting ready to go in. Moses just asks God to let him see the promised land. He understands he's not going to be able to step foot in there because he disobeyed. But he asks if he can see it. and God allows him to see it. He goes up and he sees into the promised land. And we see that God had blessed Moses so much through his life. You know, one of the interesting things that we look and we see in the passage that we just read, it says that his eyesight was undimmed. He was 120 years old. 120 years old. And of course, you know, some people back in the Bible times, they did live longer than what we do today. You know, if someone lives 120 years today, that's a miracle. It's very rare. But he lived 120 years old. He was 120 years old. He didn't have bad eyesight. His eyesight was just as sharp as ever. And his energy, that's what it says when it says his vigor. His energy had not changed at all. He's still the same energy he had when he left and led the people out of Egypt. So just think about that. You know, how much God had blessed them and seen him. Yet he came so far, yet because he disobeyed, he wasn't able to see the promised land. And sometimes that's what happens to us. Sometimes when we disobey God, we miss out on the biggest blessings in our lives. We may disobey in something small, but yet sometimes when we disobey, we can miss out on the biggest blessings. We never know what that could be. So as you go throughout your life, listen to God. If God tells you and leads you to do something, do it. Do it with all your heart, your mind, and soul. Do it with all your being. Because you never know what blessing God has for you. Because, you know, there may be a blessing that you miss out on or something fantastic that you miss out on because you didn't do it. So I just want to encourage you to be listening to God and be doing this. Now, as we go to next week, we're going to be starting in Joshua 1. We're going to be going through that whole chapter. That's the plan anyways. And we're going to see what God has for the nation of Israel as they stepped into this new adventure, into the land that he promised to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. He had promised hundreds of years before where we're at now. We're going to see what happens when they enter the promised land. And we're going to see that God takes care of them. God is there for them. They are his people. He loves them. But yet there are times whenever they don't do what they're supposed to do. And then there's punishment for that. So we're going to see that. It's going to be a fun study, I believe. So if you have any questions, definitely reach out. Let me know. And I hope y'all have a fantastic